January 1944. The sun climbs slowly over the flat plains of Texas, its light catching on the frost that clings to the barbed wire. Inside the camp, Italian prisoners of war form a quiet line, boots scraping gravel, breath clouding the cold morning air. Beyond the perimeter, a sound they have not heard in months breaks through the silence. Church bells. Distant at first, then near enough to make the guards glance up from their posts. The gates open. An American officer gestures toward the road where a small white chapel stands among oaks. No rifles raised, no orders shouted, only the steady tolling of the bell and the soft hum of wind through winter grass. For a moment, the men hesitate. They were captured soldiers of Mussolini's army, shipped across oceans, stripped of rank, expecting punishment. Yet here, in the heart of their enemy's country, they are told they may attend Sunday Mass. Some cross themselves in disbelief. Others simply stare, unable to speak. It was the first Sunday they would walk beyond the wire. As prisoners, yes, but for one sacred hour, as free men. When Italy entered World War II in June 1940, few imagined its soldiers would one day find themselves on American soil, not as invaders but as captives. The fascist regime under Benito Mussolini had promised glory and empire, yet by 1943, that illusion had collapsed in the deserts of North Africa and the mountains of Sicily. What began as a war of ambition turned into a desperate struggle for survival. Across the Mediterranean, Allied forces advanced relentlessly. Italian divisions, under-equipped and exhausted, surrendered by the tens of thousands. For the United States, the challenge was immediate. What to do with an entire army of prisoners from a collapsing Axis power? Between 1942 and 1945, more than 50,000 Italian prisoners of war were shipped to the United States. Their journey began under the watchful eyes of the Royal Navy and the U.S. Navy, crossing submarine-infested waters of the Atlantic. Packed into troop ships, these men, farmers, laborers, engineers, and clerks turned soldiers, had no idea what awaited them on the other side. Many believed they were being sent to hard labor camps or worse, given the stories they had heard about German treatment of Allied POWs. Instead, they disembarked to find clean barracks, Red Cross inspections, and food portions larger than they had seen in years. By late 1943, after the Allied invasion of Sicily and Mussolini's fall, Italy itself was divided. The new Italian government under Marshal Pietro Badoglio had signed an armistice with the Allies, effectively switching sides. Overnight, the status of Italian POWs changed from enemy combatants to co-belligerents. Yet in the confusion of war, their fate remained ambiguous. Many were still held under U.S. custody, partly for security, partly for practical reasons. America, in the midst of total war, faced severe labor shortages in agriculture and manufacturing. Italian prisoners became an unexpected workforce, helping harvest cotton, process lumber, and build roads across the American South and Midwest. The camps themselves dotted the landscape like quiet shadows of a distant conflict. From the pine forests of Arkansas and Mississippi to the rolling fields of Kansas and Texas, each camp held anywhere from a few hundred to several thousand men. The War Department and the Office of the Provost Marshal General enforced strict adherence to the Geneva Convention of 1929, ensuring POWs received fair treatment, the same rations as U.S. soldiers, access to medical care and organized recreation. The goal, as stated by American officials, was clear: to show that democracy and decency could exist even amid war. This approach contrasted sharply with what many Italians had experienced under the fascist regime. Mussolini's Italy demanded loyalty, not faith, propaganda, not conscience. Catholicism remained deeply ingrained in the Italian soul, but the regime had long sought to mold it into a political tool. In the camps, however, religion found new expression. The simple act of prayer, of being allowed to gather, to bow heads without surveillance or suspicion, became a quiet rebellion against despair. Each Sunday, as dawn broke over rows of wooden barracks, the prisoners organized their own makeshift masses. Using crude altars built from scrap wood, they knelt in circles on the dusty ground. Some carved small crucifixes from soap or pine bark. Others sang softly in Latin, their voices blending with the rustle of wind across open plains. For many, these moments offered something more profound than comfort. They were a reminder of identity, They were still Italians, still men of faith, even behind wire. The Americans watched with curiosity. To many guards, often young farm boys barely older than the prisoners, the sight of their supposed enemies kneeling in prayer was disarming. Reports from the time describe cordial interactions, occasional smiles, even small exchanges of food or cigarettes. They prayed just like we did, one guard later recalled. It was hard to see them as enemies after that. As the months passed, the War Department began to reconsider how best to manage the Italian captives. With the armistice signed, they were no longer fighting for the Axis cause. In 1944, thousands of them volunteered to join the Italian service units, ISUs, labor detachments working directly for the U.S. Army in non-combat roles. They wore American uniforms marked Italy on the sleeve and were paid modest wages. It was a transformation that symbolized something deeper, the shift from ideological enemies to reluctant allies. Still, within the camps, life remained regimented. Days began with roll call, followed by work details, drills, and education programs. The U.S. War Department established re-education initiatives, aiming to introduce democratic ideals through language lessons, newspapers, and cultural exchanges. Italian teachers among the POWs were encouraged to lecture about philosophy, history, and literature. American officers understood that treating prisoners humanely was not merely moral, it was strategic. Every well-fed, well-treated prisoner would return home one day as a witness to America's principles. In contrast, cruelty would only breed future hatred, but it was religion, not politics, that became the emotional bridge. When the U.S. military allowed Catholic chaplains to minister to Italian POWs, it sparked an unexpected chain of events. Local priests from nearby towns were invited to conduct Sunday Mass, often inside the camps. The first of these ceremonies felt like a miracle to the prisoners. They entered the chapel, some weeping quietly, to hear familiar hymns, to see a priest in vestments, to taste communion again after years of deprivation. Yet the greatest surprise came when, one Sunday, the men were told they could attend Mass outside the camp fence alongside American civilians. The decision was not made lightly. Military officials debated security concerns, local sentiment, and the potential for escape. But reports from early trials were overwhelmingly positive. In rural communities, especially in the deeply Catholic towns of the South and Midwest, parishioners welcomed the Italians with cautious warmth. Some even hosted them for Sunday meals afterward, astonished by their politeness and gratitude. The prisoners, in turn, wrote home astonished that their captors showed more mercy than their own regime ever had. By late 1944, the phenomenon had spread across dozens of camps. From Camp Atterbury in Indiana to Camp Hereford in Texas, Italian POWs attended Sunday Mass in local churches, escorted by minimal guards or none at all. There were no escapes. There were no incidents, only shared hymns, shared silence, and shared humanity. American newspapers began publishing stories about these gatherings, the enemy soldiers who prayed with us. It was a quiet but powerful piece of wartime propaganda, demonstrating that freedom was not only a political concept, but a moral one. For the Italian prisoners, these Sundays became sacred not only for their faith but for what they represented, a world beyond the wire, where the war's divisions briefly vanished. Many later wrote that these hours restored their sense of dignity. It was the first time I felt human again, recalled one former POW decades later. They trusted us, and that trust was freedom. This moment, simple, humane, profoundly symbolic, captured the paradox of war. In a conflict defined by brutality and dehumanization, here was an act of compassion that transcended ideology. The Mass was more than a religious service. It was a declaration of moral victory. It reminded both sides that even in war, the soul of humanity could not be imprisoned. And as more Sundays passed, with bells ringing and gates opening, something began to change in the hearts of those who witnessed it, Americans and Italians alike. What began as an experiment in decency would soon become one of the most quietly transformative gestures of the war. In the grand theater of war, the story of the Italian prisoners in America was small, but it revealed a truth far greater than any victory in battle. Beneath the surface of global conflict, it became a study of how ordinary men, torn from their homes and ideologies, rediscovered their humanity in the unlikeliest place, the land of their enemy. For American military planners, the humane treatment of prisoners was not simply charity, it was deliberate policy. In 1942, as the first Italian POWs began arriving from North Africa, the War Department and the Office of the Provost Marshal General issued detailed directives based on the Geneva Convention of 1929. The United States, they insisted, would hold itself to a higher standard. The enemy, one circular noted, is still a man. Food rations matched those of American soldiers. Medical treatment was prompt. Mail was censored but permitted. Each camp had a library, workshops, and recreation areas. To the War Department, such treatment was not weakness but proof, to both allies and adversaries, that democracy could remain moral under pressure. This approach had a deeper purpose. Reports from intelligence officers suggested that well-treated Italian POWs were far more likely to abandon fascism, cooperate with the Allies, and spread pro-American sentiment upon returning home. In a war of propaganda as much as weapons, kindness became strategy. The United States recognized that compassion, displayed consistently and publicly, could become its most persuasive weapon. The Italians, however, were slow to believe it. When the first transport ships docked at ports in Virginia and Louisiana, the prisoners stepped onto American soil expecting humiliation. Many had heard stories of Allied bombings over Naples or Palermo and assumed they would be met with revenge. Instead, they were greeted with logistical efficiency, medical checkups, and orderly transport to camps far from the front lines. At Camp Atterbury, Indiana, the first arrivals reportedly looked around in silence, unable to reconcile the neat barracks and open spaces with what they expected captivity to be. America was a mystery, one former POW, Giovanni D'Angelo, recalled years later. We thought we would be punished. Instead, they gave us bread and said, "You may rest now." Yet even within that relative comfort, the prisoners faced an inner war, a battle between pride and gratitude, loyalty and faith. For men raised under 20 years of fascist propaganda, the American landscape felt both alien and disarming. The guards spoke softly. The rules were firm but fair. The rations were ample. Some prisoners wrote home astonished that even their captors complained about the food portions, which to them felt luxurious. "We eat more here as prisoners," one letter read, "than we did in Mussolini's army." Still, it was Sunday that held the greatest meaning. Among Italian soldiers, Catholic faith was not merely belief, and it was identity. From small villages in Sicily to the mountains of Piedmont, the rhythm of life had always followed the bell of the local church. War had shattered that rhythm. For months, years even, many had fought without confession, without mass, without a priest's blessing before battle. Their surrender, humiliating as it was, had also brought a strange relief. Captivity meant the guns had fallen silent, and the soul could breathe again. In early 1943, the War Department approved the assignment of Catholic chaplains fluent in Italian to serve in major POW camps. Father Thomas W. McCarthy, stationed in a camp near Hereford, Texas, wrote in his journal, "They listen with such hunger, as if the words of the gospel are water in a desert." He described prisoners kneeling in the dirt, heads bowed, many weeping quietly during the first Mass celebrated since their capture. They are soldiers no longer, he noted. They are sons, brothers, fathers, simply men who wish to be forgiven. It was not only priests who noticed the change. American officers saw morale rise, discipline improve, and incidents of defiance drop sharply. Faith, it seemed, succeeded where authority had failed. The Mass became not just spiritual relief but social order, a rhythm that restored dignity within confinement. The camp, for 1 hour each week, ceased to be a prison and became a parish. Then came the next step, an idea born as much from practicality as humanity. By 1944, many Italian POWs were classified as co-belligerents following Italy's armistice. They were no longer considered dangerous enemy combatants. Commanders in certain districts began experimenting with controlled day passes, allowing small groups to work in nearby farms or attend special services under guard. In some regions, the trust deepened enough that the guards were eventually left behind. Local priests vouched for the men, farmers offered them rides in pickup trucks, and the unimaginable happened. Italian POWs walking freely into American towns on Sunday mornings, not to fight but to pray. In towns like Hearne, Texas, or Camp Shelby, Mississippi, parishioners watched the newcomers with a mix of curiosity and caution. The Italians arrived in neatly pressed khaki uniforms marked PW, heads lowered respectfully. They filled the pews quietly, following the priest's gestures with practiced reverence. After Mass, they filed out in order, nodding to families who stood at the door. They looked like our own boys, one woman remembered. You could see the homesickness in their faces. The encounters grew more personal. Children approached the Italians shyly, offering candy or flowers. Some prisoners helped carry church benches or repair roofs. A few even joined the choir. American farmers, many of whom had lost sons in Europe, found themselves talking to men who might once have faced them in battle. The war for a moment dissolved in human contact. Letters from these encounters survive in church archives and military reports. One from an Italian prisoner named Paolo Bianchi reads, "The people smiled at us not as enemies but as neighbors. I prayed beside an American soldier's mother. I saw her eyes full of grief, and I wanted to tell her that we, too, have mothers who pray the same way." Another, from a parish priest in Arkansas, wrote to the War Department, "There is more peace in these Sundays than in any armistice. The men come to us as strangers and leave as brothers." To the American press, these stories became proof of national virtue. Newspapers published accounts of enemy soldiers attending church with locals, emphasizing that not one escape attempt or incident had been reported. The Red Cross commended the United States for upholding both the letter and the spirit of the Geneva Convention. For many in the public, it confirmed the belief that America fought not just for victory, but for a moral world order. Behind the scenes, however, some officers viewed it differently. They saw in these acts a subtle weapon, psychological warfare through kindness. Each prisoner who experienced freedom, trust, and respect became a potential advocate for American ideals. In Italy's shattered post-war landscape, the voices of these former POWs would carry influence. Indeed, after the war, many testified that their admiration for America began not with speeches or propaganda, but with the sound of church bells through barbed wire. For the Italians, the memory of those Sundays remained vivid for the rest of their lives. The ritual was always the same: the distant bells, the gates creaking open, the walk down a gravel road bordered by cotton fields or tall grass. They entered a church still half filled with the scent of wax and wood polish, sunlight spilling through stained glass onto the floor. There, they knelt beside the very people who were funding the war that had captured them. Yet in that sacred space, the war no longer mattered. The prayers were the same. The language of faith bridged what ideology had torn apart. Not every American approved. In some towns, there were complaints. Families who had lost sons overseas resented seeing enemy soldiers treated with leniency. Letters were sent to newspapers, questioning why prisoners were allowed freedoms that some citizens did not enjoy. But even among critics, the moral authority of the church carried weight. Local bishops defended the policy, arguing that mercy was not weakness but strength. Christ himself was never a soldier, one wrote, but he understood captives better than generals ever could. The story spread quietly through military networks. Other camps adopted the practice, adjusting to local circumstances. In predominantly Protestant regions, Italian prisoners were still allowed religious gatherings within camp chapels. Protestant ministers sometimes attended as guests, observing the unity faith could foster. In a war often defined by division, such moments offered a rare glimpse of reconciliation. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army took note of the results. Reports indicated that incidents of insubordination among Italian POWs had dropped significantly. Productivity and work details rose. The men who attended outside masses were more cooperative and less prone to despair. The War Department cited it as evidence that humane treatment produced tangible results, a victory not on the battlefield, but in the human heart. For some prisoners, the experience reshaped their view of the enemy entirely. "Before we thought Americans were monsters," said one Italian serviceman after the war. "Then we saw how they prayed, and we realized they were men like us." Another recounted that when he returned to Naples in 1946, he told his neighbors, "If America wins, perhaps it is because they have not lost their souls." By late 1944, Italian service units had become a vital part of the American war machine. More than 30,000 Italians volunteered, working in depots, hospitals, and construction battalions across the United States. Many of these men were the same who once attended Mass under guard. Their cooperation, born of respect rather than coercion, helped sustain the Allied logistics chain in the final push toward victory in Europe. The War Department quietly acknowledged the irony. The same men who once fought under Mussolini were now helping the Allies defeat Germany. In the quiet of those Sundays, the war's grand ideology seemed distant. For the men kneeling side by side, American farmers, Italian prisoners, parish priests, it was no longer about victory or defeat. It was about the fragile endurance of decency. The sound of bells across the plains carried a message that transcended language. Faith could outlast fear. And as those bells rang, the war outside grew closer to its end. In Europe, the Allies advanced through Italy, liberating Rome in June 1944. Mussolini, once hailed as Il Duce, was reduced to a fugitive in the north. Yet in America's heartland, his former soldiers were discovering something the regime had never taught them: the quiet strength of compassion. That discovery, born in prayer and trust, would soon reach its most powerful expression. The day the barriers of wire and war truly dissolved, and enemy soldiers stepped fully into the lives of the people they had been taught to hate. It was a Sunday unlike any other. April 1944, the war still raging across oceans and continents, but here, in the heart of Texas, the morning was still. The air smelled of dust and wet grass after a night of rain. The horizon shimmered with the first heat of spring. Inside Camp Hereford, a few hundred Italian prisoners stood at attention as the camp gates creaked open. For weeks, rumors had spread among them. Some said they were to be transferred. Others believed a new work detail awaited. Instead, an American officer stepped forward and spoke quietly through a translator. "You have permission to attend Mass, in town." The words hung in the air like a fragile echo. For a long moment, no one moved. The men stared at one another, uncertain if they had heard correctly. "Attend Mass and outside the wire, among Americans," the order was repeated. The gates, once symbols of their captivity, swung wide. The prisoners formed into groups of 10. Guards accompanied them, rifles slung casually, their faces relaxed. Trucks rattled down the dusty road toward Hereford St. Mary's Parish, a small white wooden church surrounded by cotton fields and windmills. The townspeople had been informed days before. There was hesitation, even fear. Many had sons overseas, some fighting in Italy itself, letting enemy soldiers into their church, and it felt unthinkable. Yet the local priest, Father Joseph Dwyer, insisted. "They are Catholics," he told the congregation. "Their souls are no less deserving of grace because of the flag they wore." When the first truck arrived, a hush fell over the crowd gathered outside. The Italian prisoners stepped down slowly, their uniforms clean, each marked with bold white letters, PW. They walked in line toward the church doors, eyes lowered, hands clasped. The townsfolk watched in silence as they entered. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of candles and incense. Sunlight streamed through narrow stained glass windows, coloring the men's faces in soft hues of blue and gold. Father Dwyer began the service. His voice trembled slightly as he greeted them in broken Italian. "Benvenuti, fratelli nel Signore." "Welcome, brothers in the Lord." The Mass unfolded with solemn beauty. Hymns in Latin rose from both sides of the aisle, voices of prisoners and Americans blending until one could no longer tell them apart. For those few minutes there were no enemies, no sides, no uniforms, only men kneeling shoulder to shoulder in prayer. Giovanni de Rosa, a former artilleryman from Naples, later wrote of that morning. "I looked to my left and saw an old farmer kneeling beside me, his hands trembling as he prayed. I thought of my own father back home, perhaps praying for me in some ruined church. I wanted to speak to the man, to tell him I was sorry, not for losing the war, but for believing that enemies could not share the same God." The choir sang Ave Maria. Several prisoners wept openly. Some crossed themselves over and over, as if to be certain they were not dreaming. When communion came, Father Dwyer hesitated for a brief moment, unsure how the congregation would react. Then he stepped down the aisle and placed the host upon the outstretched palms of men who had, only a year earlier, worn the insignia of a hostile army. The church was silent but for the sound of whispered prayers. After the service, the Italians filed out quietly, bowing their heads to the townspeople waiting near the steps. An elderly woman approached one of them, offering a small wooden rosary. "For your mother," she said softly. The soldier took it with trembling hands, unable to answer in English but nodding with tears in his eyes. That gesture, a simple exchange of faith, became the symbol of everything that moment represented. Reports from the U.S. Army's Provost Marshal General's office later described the event as a unique success of humane policy. No prisoner attempted escape. No disturbance occurred. Local newspapers published stories the next day. Italian prisoners attend Mass with townspeople. Service marks a triumph of Christian brotherhood. But beyond the headlines, something deeper had happened. The psychological wall separating captor and captive had begun to crumble. The Americans saw in the Italians not faceless soldiers, but men capable of reverence, of humility. The Italians saw in the Americans not ruthless conquerors, but people guided by conscience. The impact spread far beyond Hereford. Similar events took place in Camp Atterbury, Indiana, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and Camp Shelby, Mississippi. Each time the same pattern emerged: caution, surprise, then quiet transformation. The first encounter dissolved suspicion. The second brought conversation. Soon Italian POWs were invited to assist with church repairs, to play music at parish gatherings, even to join in holiday feasts. At Camp Atterbury, one Italian prisoner, Corporal Angelo Martini, played the organ for Sunday Mass. When he finished, the congregation applauded. Father Patrick Moran, the local priest, wrote afterward, "There was joy in their playing and peace in their faces. For 1 hour they were free men in the house of God." This freedom was not symbolic, it was tangible. In many cases, the guards waited outside while the prisoners attended Mass unescorted. Trust had replaced suspicion. It was unprecedented in the history of modern warfare. The War Department, initially cautious, began encouraging these interactions. Reports indicated that discipline improved markedly in camps where religious services were frequent and open. Instances of resistance, hunger strikes, and escape attempts fell sharply. The logic was clear. When treated as men rather than captives, they behaved as such. Yet the most profound changes could not be measured in statistics. They occurred quietly within the hearts of those present. In Hereford, local teenager Helen Porter later recalled watching the prisoners depart after Mass. "They looked no different than our own boys who had gone to war. One waved to me, just a small wave. I remember thinking, maybe this is how the world heals." In the weeks that followed, the relationship between the camp and the town softened further. Italian POWs began assisting in local harvests, their presence greeted with nods rather than suspicion. Some townsfolk left baskets of fruit or bread near the camp gate. The prisoners responded with hand-carved gifts, crucifixes, toys, small paintings made from scrap wood and ink. In letters home, they described America as a land where even in war, men do not forget God. Many confessed confusion at the kindness they received. Propaganda had painted Americans as greedy, godless, and cruel. What they found instead was a nation that valued mercy even in victory. By the autumn of 1944, American chaplains noted that Sunday Mass attendance among Italian POWs had become near universal. It was not mandatory. It was hunger, spiritual hunger. The same men who had fought under fascist banners now bowed their heads beside their former enemies. And so, each Sunday, a quiet ritual unfolded across the American landscape. Bells rang from parish steeples echoing across cotton fields and prairie towns. Trucks arrived from the camps. The prisoners stepped down, crossed themselves, and entered. Locals shifted uneasily at first, then smiled. Over time, familiarity replaced fear. The war seemed far away during those hours. For the Italian soldiers, the Mass symbolized a return to civilization, a brief escape from the absurdity of war. For the Americans, it reaffirmed the moral contrast they sought to uphold, that democracy and faith could coexist with strength. In the words of Father McCarthy from Camp Hereford, "We won no battle that morning. We conquered no hill, but something greater was achieved. The soul of man proved unkillable." One of the most powerful moments came months later, on Christmas Eve 1944, when local parishes invited Italian POWs to participate in midnight Mass. In several towns, the prisoners performed carols in Latin, the sound of their voices strong, clear, full of longing, filled the churches with emotion. Many parishioners wept. American officers stood at the back, caps in hand, moved to silence. The war still raged in Europe, but for that single night peace felt within reach. These gatherings were more than gestures of goodwill. They were quiet acts of defiance against the very logic of total war. Where other nations used hatred to sustain morale, America allowed compassion to speak. In the grand strategy of global conflict, such gestures may have seemed small, yet they carried immense symbolic weight, messages that would outlast the war itself. As 1945 approached, victory was near. But within the camps, the Italians had already experienced a different kind of liberation. They had been shown that even in a world consumed by violence, faith and decency could survive. For many, it was the first time they saw Christianity not as ritual or power, but as mercy lived out in action. The day the gates opened for Mass became a story told and retold among the prisoners. Some wrote of it in memoirs. Others carried the memory home in silence, but all remembered the feeling. The quiet disbelief as the locks clicked open, the breeze beyond the fence, the sound of bells drawing them towards something greater than war. That morning in Texas, and in dozens of other small towns across America, was the turning point. It was where enemy soldiers ceased to be enemies, where a nation at war proved that victory of conscience was worth more than conquest. The men would later return to a ruined homeland, to cities scarred by bombings, to families lost or scattered. Yet the story they carried back with them was one of dignity restored by kindness. It began with an open gate and the tolling of a bell. And as those bells faded across the plains, they left behind an echo that would shape the war's aftermath, a question that lingered in every heart that witnessed it. If mercy is possible here, amid the barbed wire of war, what else might humanity yet achieve when the guns fall silent? When the bells fell silent and the war began to wane, the Italian prisoners who had knelt in American churches carried home a story unlike any other. They had lived through the collapse of Mussolini's empire, endured defeat and crossed an ocean as captives. Yet what they remembered most vividly was not the battles or the barbed wire, but the sound of those Sunday bells, and the unexpected mercy that came with them. By the spring of 1945, Germany was in retreat and Italy lay in ruins. Allied forces had liberated Rome, and Mussolini's puppet regime in the north was crumbling. For the Italian POWs in America, the end of the war brought a mixture of hope and dread. Many longed to return home, but they feared what awaited them: famine, political chaos, and the devastation of their villages. Letters from relatives when they arrived painted a grim picture. Cities flattened by bombs, families displaced, fields abandoned. For these men, captivity had become a strange kind of refuge. The U.S. Army began preparing for repatriation. Between late 1945 and 1946, thousands of Italian POWs boarded ships in New York, Norfolk, and New Orleans bound for Naples. Their departure was quiet, no parades, no farewells. Yet many Americans, including the townspeople who had prayed beside them, gathered at the docks or camp gates to wave goodbye. They brought gifts, rosaries, small flags, photographs. In Hereford, Texas, Father Dwyer blessed the departing men one last time, his voice breaking as he said, "Go home in peace. Remember that you are our brothers." Reports from the office of the Provost Marshal General described the Italian POWs as exceptionally cooperative and well-behaved. Only a handful had ever attempted escape. In fact, many had formed genuine friendships with American civilians. Some wrote letters for years after returning home. In one, a former prisoner named Carlo Rossi wrote to a family in Arkansas, "You gave me bread and trust. I shall never forget that I found kindness in the land of my enemy." Statistics reflected what compassion had achieved. Of the roughly 50,000 Italian POWs held in the U.S., fewer than 100 died, most from illness, not violence. The mortality rate was less than 0.2%, an extraordinary figure compared to other theaters of war. By contrast, American prisoners held by Germany and Japan faced death rates 10 times higher. The humane treatment of Axis POWs in the U.S. was not a secret. It became a quiet point of national pride, cited by the Red Cross and international observers as a model for post-war conduct. But beyond the numbers, the moral impact was profound. In 1946, The Vatican's Secretariat of State received reports from bishops across Italy describing returning POWs as ambassadors of decency. Many testified that they had found faith renewed in captivity. "I lost my weapon," one man said to his parish priest, "but I found my soul." Their accounts contradicted the fascist narrative that had once depicted America as a nation of godless materialists. Instead, these men spoke of Sunday Mass in wooden chapels, of priests who preached mercy, of farmers who treated them with respect. The U.S. government, too, took notice. Post-war analyses concluded that humane treatment had yielded strategic dividends. Italian cooperation in the Italian service units had provided critical labor for the Allied war effort, from unloading ships to repairing vehicles and producing munitions. These men had worked not out of fear but gratitude. The War Department's final report on the POW program stated plainly, "Respect for the dignity of the individual has proven a weapon of enduring power." Across Europe, other nations took note. British and Canadian camps had generally adhered to the Geneva Convention, but none matched the scale of religious and cultural freedom seen in the United States. The American model, chaplain services, access to education, community engagement, became a reference point for future POW policy. The lesson was clear. Decency was not a weakness of war, but a strength of civilization. For the Italian prisoners themselves, the psychological transformation was irreversible. Many returned home determined to rebuild a new Italy, one unshackled from dictatorship. Their experience of American democracy, even from behind fences, had shown them a society that valued discussion, fairness, and faith without fear. Former POWs became school teachers, engineers, small-town mayors. In their local parishes, they told stories of American kindness, describing how they had prayed beside the very people whose bombs once fell on their cities. One of the most moving accounts came from Father Nicola Massi, an Italian chaplain who had been interned with his countrymen in Kansas. Writing in 1947, he reflected, "The Americans conquered us not with arms but with mercy. They gave us freedom inside captivity. It was there, not in battle, that we saw the true strength of their faith." In small Italian towns from Tuscany to Calabria, word spread of these experiences. When American troops arrived during the liberation, many villagers welcomed them warmly, a reaction shaped partly by the stories of returned POWs. In some areas, those former captives even served as interpreters or guides for U.S. forces, helping to ease tensions during the transition from war to peace. The contrast with other Axis prisoners was stark. German POWs in the United States had also been treated fairly under the Geneva Convention, but they remained largely isolated, their ideology more deeply entrenched. Few were invited to local churches or homes. Japanese prisoners, by contrast, were too few in number and too culturally distant for similar exchanges to occur. The Italian case was unique, a confluence of shared religion, rural familiarity, and mutual recognition of humanity. In the American heartland, the legacy of those Sundays lingered. The churches that once opened their doors to the prisoners remembered the experience as a moment of grace amid war. At St. Mary's in Hereford, parishioners later commissioned a small plaque. "To the Italian soldiers who worshipped here, 1944-45, faith united us when war divided the world." In Indiana, descendants of farmers who had worked with Italian POWs still kept handmade crucifixes or carvings passed down from that time. For the prisoners, those objects carried even deeper meaning. In post-war Italy, many kept small souvenirs, photographs of American churches, scraps of hymn books, rosaries gifted by parishioners. They were reminders not of defeat but of redemption. Some told their children, "Remember, there was a land where the enemy led us. Pray." The sociologists and military historians who later studied the Italian POW experience often pointed to it as an early example of soft power. But for those who lived it, it was something simpler, a rediscovery of faith. When Italian veterans gathered decades later, they spoke less of battles and more of bell towers, chapels, and the kindness of strangers. In 1984, on the 40th anniversary of the Hereford Mass, surviving prisoners and local residents reunited at St. Mary's. Old men, gray-haired and stooped, stood beside the descendants of their former guards. They prayed together once more. The local newspaper quoted one of them, Pietro Cangemi, now 70 years old. We were enemies once, but that day in 1944 we prayed for the same peace. It came late, but it came. Such reunions became a quiet tradition across the United States. In Indiana, Alabama, and Nebraska, small memorials appeared near former campsites, simple crosses marking places where faith had bridged enmity. Local archives preserved letters exchanged between prisoners and Americans, their tone gentle and reflective. One wrote, "War taught us how to hate. You taught us how to forgive." For the U.S. military, these outcomes validated an approach that combined discipline with humanity. After 1945, American policymakers used the Italian example when establishing post-war reconstruction programs in Germany and Japan. The logic was the same. If kindness could transform captives into allies, perhaps it could also rebuild nations. In Italy itself, the cultural memory of those POWs shaped post-war politics in subtle ways. Many who had seen the fairness of their captors supported closer ties with the West during the early years of the Cold War. When Italy joined NATO in 1949, a number of statesmen privately credited the American example witnessed by returning prisoners. The seeds of alliance had been planted not in conferences or treaties, but in chapels and farm towns half a world away. Yet for the men who had lived it, the meaning was deeply personal. In their memoirs, they often described a single image: the open gate, the church bell, the road lined with oak trees. It symbolized everything they had learned, that freedom was not always won on battlefields, but sometimes given through grace. Years later, one former prisoner wrote simply, "The Americans taught me that even war cannot chain the soul. When they opened the gate for Mass, they opened it for my faith as well. The war had taken much from them: comrades, homes, years of youth. But it had given one thing back: the certainty that mercy was stronger than any ideology. And so, when those men returned to their shattered homeland, they carried with them a new kind of victory, not military but moral. They had witnessed the difference between tyranny and freedom not in speeches or slogans, but in the quiet kindness of a Sunday morning. That was the lasting aftermath of those open gates and ringing bells, proof that even in a world torn apart by hatred, compassion could still prevail. The war ended long ago. The camps were dismantled, the barracks torn down, the fences rusted away beneath the weight of time. But in the quiet plains of America, where the wind still moves through fields of wheat and cotton, the memory endures, faint yet indestructible. Every Sunday, in places like Hereford, Atterbury, and Shelby, the church bells still ring. Their sound drifts across the same roads once walked by Italian soldiers, men who came as prisoners and left as witnesses to a truth that transcended war. Those bells carry no nation's anthem, no banner of conquest. They speak instead of mercy, of a faith that refused to surrender when the world was burning. History often remembers wars through battles, weapons, and treaties. But the soul of that era can also be found in smaller moments, in a chapel filled with sunlight, in hands clasped across enemy lines, in the unspoken understanding that decency is the final measure of civilization. The masses attended by Italian POWs were not grand acts of diplomacy. They were gestures of conscience, quiet, human, and profoundly moral. When those men returned to their ruined homeland, they brought with them an invisible legacy. They told their children that America was strong not because of its armies, but because it had remembered the value of compassion. They spoke of the guards who smiled, the priests who welcomed them, the strangers who prayed beside them. And in that telling, they passed on a vision of humanity that no war could destroy. Today, the lesson remains. Strength built on cruelty fades. Strength built on mercy endures. The story of the Italian prisoners who were allowed to worship in freedom reminds us that even amid conflict, the human spirit seeks connection, not domination. It is a reminder that victory means little if one forgets the dignity of the defeated. So when the bells ring on quiet Sunday mornings, echoing across forgotten plains, they carry more than sound. They carry memory of men who found faith behind wire, of a nation that chose grace over vengeance, and of the eternal truth that in the darkest hours of history, kindness is its own form of triumph.